Good evening. Last Thursday, the United Nations General Assembly demanded for the second time this year that the Soviet Union remove its troops from Afghanistan. Once again, the vote was overwhelmingly against Moscow, 111 to 22, headed by an unusual coalition of third world nations. The first vote was last January, shortly after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan with 85,000 troops to wipe out rebel forces threatening the Soviet puppet regime. Moscow has not heeded either vote, nor has it defeated the rebels, despite heavy losses on both sides. First-hand accounts of the fighting are rare, but here is a report sent from the rebel side nearly 2 weeks ago by Viz News, the news film agency.
These pictures, taken by a rebel cameraman above a village in the Loga Valley, show one of the Soviet search-and-destroy operations. The approach of the armored convoy sent mujahideen fleeing to the hills. But villagers, hiding behind garden walls, had to run for their lives when the convoy's fire was turned in their direction. Operations like this one represent the free fire tactics adopted by the Soviets this summer. They give full license to indiscriminate attacks on villages. Rebels are driven away, but when the armored infantry retreats, it leaves behind high civilian casualties and destroyed communities, which lead to ever-growing refugee numbers. Outlying villages are also targets for shelling and attacks by helicopter gunships. The rebels have long insisted they needed heavy weapons to defeat the Russians. Now a number of them are armed with rocket launchers, thought to have been bought by sympathetic Arabs with a possible American or Chinese involvement during shipment. With such armaments, the rebels are able to ambush heavily armored Soviet convoys. In this exchange, the mujahideen claim to have stopped 70 tanks and lorries, despite aerial harassment. The rebels say they were able to blow up an ammunition carrier and damage a number of trucks. The rebels are carefully selecting their attacks, concentrating on hit-and-run operations, which promise the best chance of capturing arms and ammunition. Owen Patterson reporting.
Since that report, other Afghan sources have reported rebel hopes fading, with arms and ammunition declining unless they get outside help. Tonight, the Afghan war as the Afghans see it and want us to. Jim?
Robin, there are two groups of Afghans in the United States now pleading for help, military and diplomatic. Among those pushing for military help is Saduddin Shpoon, a University of Kabul professor who was active in the armed resistance to the Soviet occupation. Professor, how much armed resistance is there left now to the Soviets?
Well, the armed resistance against the Soviets in Afghanistan is as strong as it was. I don't agree with the theory or with the claim that the Soviets are gaining ground. They're not gaining ground. And the lull of the winter is as much a setback for the Soviets as it is for the armed resistance.
What is the situation in general terms now? How much of the country and its functions does the Soviet Union control, and how much do the resistance forces control?
The Soviets usually control a few of the cities, the airfields, the barracks, and they're confined in their tanks and entrenchments. And the freedom fighters control the rest of the country during the day and night, and these cities, these Soviet strongholds during the nights. As a result, when the Soviets impose curfew at night, it's a curfew on themselves and not on the freedom fighters.
How well organized are the resistance forces now?
After the Soviet invasion, the resistance force has started to organize itself because it has to cope with not only with the Afghan army like during the Amin and Taraki, but against a very sophisticated war technology equipped with laser, with computerized war machinery, with Mi-24. And so accordingly, the freedom fighters are organizing themselves in modern guerrilla warfare.
Where are they getting their arms?
They are still fighting with the arms captured from the Soviets, from the defectors, from the army, and a few other pieces that they had from the past, and also some that they can buy on the free market in the border stretch called Dara. There's a free market.
Professor, you're not suggesting, are you, sir, that it will be possible for the armed resistance to actually rid Afghanistan of the Soviet Union, that the resistance, in other words, will defeat the Soviet army and they will leave with their tail between their legs.
No, not at all. We don't have that kind of illusion. We know our limits and we know our capabilities. We intend to, and we have succeeded so far, and we will succeed to stall them, to hurt them, and to stop their base, their machinery, and bring pressure on them, on their war economy and their war machinery, for as long as it takes for them to sit down for a political negotiation.
I see. What do you want the United States to do in this matter that it hasn't done up till now?
Well, the United States can do a lot, and so can the rest of the free world. I think we have contributed a lot in unmasking the face of the Soviets, in exposing them to the world, in showing their real expansionistic plans and ambitions. And I think that directly affects the decisions, that must directly affect the decisions of the free world.
Do you want the free world to give the resistance fighters, the rebels, more arms?
Yes, arms is one of the items on the agenda.
Do you want it to be given to you directly or through third parties, or do you care?
Well, as long as we get it inside.
You don't care how it gets there?
I don't care how it gets there, as long as it gets inside without jeopardizing the positions of our neighboring countries. It's welcome.
Professor Spoon, thank you. Next to a representative of the Afghan group committed to a peaceful diplomatic solution to their country's problem, he's Akhtar Mohammad Pakhtiyawal, an Afghan career diplomat who made international headlines when he defected last month. He was the leader of the Afghan delegation to a UNESCO conference in Belgrade, Yugoslavia. After making a speech denouncing the Soviet domination of Afghanistan, he flew to West Germany, where he was granted political asylum. Why did you defect, sir?
Well, since the first intervention of Soviet Union in April 1978, I was trying to be some kind helpful to my country people to stop Soviet Union intervention in Afghanistan. So I did not have this chance. So I tried to be helpful to my country in some way. You see, in April of this year, I had a chance to go to Wellington to a conference. I tried to disclose Soviets disaster they are doing in my country, but I thought it is a very small conference, it will not be useful, so better wait to do it in Belgrade, which is a bigger conference. So I was planning to do this, and I did it in Belgrade and said the facts about Afghanistan. I informed the world how the Russian is killing us and how they are dominating us.
Let's take those one at a time. When you say they're killing you, you mean literally killing the people, your people?
Yes.
I read a report today that some 50,000 Afghans have been killed one way or another since the invasion. Does that gel with figures that you have?
No, I would say it is 16,000. At the end of Amin regime, this was announced 15,000. By Babra Karmal. Almost another 1,000 was killed by Karmal on the streets. So it's almost 16,000.
60,000.
16,000. This 16,000 is that people that taken at midnight from their houses, families together, clergies, teachers, professors, and engineers, doctors. They were taken to the jail, tortured first, and then they were killed in polygon, even not shot. Most of them were killed by passing the caterpillar on them, you see.
Is that the same sort of thing going on now, still going on? Anybody
well,
who
no,
opposes
you see, when Babra Karmal came, he announced that he will not kill somebody. He will not put somebody in the jail. But you know what they are doing now? they don't take them to the jail. They're just killing them on the street before they take them to the jail. You see?
What do you feel that the armed resistance that Professor Spoon and his people are mounting is going to eventually lead in a successful outcome? In other words, to get the Russians out of your country?
Well, it's very difficult, you see, to kick out Russian with this big power, you see, but we are fighting against them with old guns, and the guns the Mujahideen are taken from Soviet troops or from Afghan troops while they are joining them, you see.
Mm-hmm.
But we are resisting. We are looking forward for the peace-loving people of the world to help us to find a solution for this.
A peaceful solution.
Peaceful solution. This political solution. This is the only way to solve the problem. This confrontation of arm doesn't solve the problem. I don't believe that some country should fight against Soviet Union to solve our problem. But
well, how can there be a peaceful diplomatic solution? I mean, where would that come from? What would be the...
You see, what we are trying is to get all the Western countries and non-alliance countries, and Islamic world, to take the same position in solving Afghan problem. Well, there is, you know, that still some countries are, even our some Islamic countries are voting against Afghan problem, and some non-alliance countries still abstains in the cause of Afghanistan. So we are trying to converge, you see, the idea of the whole world to push Soviet Union.
But thus far, that approach hasn't worked, has it, sir?
No, it hasn't, but still the world should try it. Try it and try it again, you see. The Soviet Union should leave. This is our own right to determine which kind of social and political and economical system we want. This is not Soviets' right to impose a kind of government or puppet government or a social system which the people doesn't like it.
Let's see. Thank you. Robin?
Another view now from an Afghani who lives here but had traveled back and forth to Afghanistan until the 1978 Soviet intervention. He is Zalmay Khalilzad, professor of political science at Columbia University. Professor Khalilzad has been a consultant for the U.S. Defense Department and has done research on options for American policy. Professor Khalilzad, how do you view the situation now, from your information? Is the Soviet position improving?
Well, I think that based on the indications that I have seen, it is very difficult to make the case that the Soviet position has in fact improved. All indications are that, to the contrary, that while initially the Soviets controlled not only the Afghan cities and highways, but some of the countryside, recently there have been challenges to Soviet control of some of the Afghan cities. In September, for example, for several days, it was unclear as to who controlled the city of Herat in western Afghanistan, whether it was the Soviets or the Afghan partisans.
Well, would you say that the position of the Afghan resistance fighters has improved?
I would argue that the position of the resistance has improved. That is based on several reasons. One, I think they have access to better weapons now than they did initially, that they have access to better officers and command and control problems. At the same time, I think that the morale of the resistance is higher today than it was at the beginning of the conflict.
How do you explain the reports that we've been reading recently in our newspapers that the resistance may be fading and that they are very short of arms and supplies and that their morale is lower?
Well, obviously, when you compare the forces that the resistance movement is faced with, that is the Soviet army, and when you compare that to the capability of the resistance in terms of equipment at this time, then the resistance is not as well equipped as especially the partisan would like to. But when you compare the resistance movement to the period right after the invasion, their situation has improved. But the resistance has problems of its own. Its problems has to do with lack of unity among the various groups fighting the Soviet Union. It has to do also with enormous economic and food-related problem that the areas that are the scene of greatest resistance is faced with. In fact, the Afghan problem or the resistance problem may be not only in arms but in organization as well as in food and supplies.
How divided are the Afghan people themselves about continuing to fight, continuing to offer armed resistance to the Soviets?
My sense, Robin, is that the Afghan people are generally united in their opposition to the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. They are divided in organizations or in means and ways of challenging the Soviet control.
Do some want to stop fighting because it's too costly?
It appears that some argue, as Mr. Paktiawala has just argued, that armed resistance is not the way to defeat the Soviets. But I think that still is a minority opinion. It seems that most Afghans believe that armed resistance is an essential component of a strategy to force the Soviet Union to withdraw, but while continuing fighting, ways and means have to be found for a political settlement.
As Dr. Spoon suggested.
As Dr. Spoon has suggested.
We're now going to have a new administration in the United States. What realistic policy options remain open?
I think
for the U.S.?
For the United States, the Soviet invasion has posed several challenges. The U.S. faces the challenge of what policies it can follow to make it unlikely for the Soviet Union to pursue a similar policy elsewhere in that very important region. Two, that the U.S. has to find ways and means of redressing the military imbalance in the region so that it can contain Soviet expansion if it does occur. And that it also needs to develop a relationship with sympathetic groups and powers in the region that can help the United States follow an effective policy in that part of the world. And in this strategy of containing the Soviet Union, is an important element of that is that Afghanistan does not become pacified under Soviet domination. And the options in that regard are complicated, and it has to do not only with the U.S. desire, but also with the policies and preferences of some of the countries in the region, in particular Pakistan. I think that the Afghan resistance, its level of effectiveness, does not depend on the Afghans alone. It also depends on what the outside powers, including the United States and the regional powers, do. And therefore, the administration, the incoming administration, faces a challenge in Afghanistan and in the area beyond Afghanistan.
Well, thank you. Jim?
Dr. Spoon and another Afghan university professor involved in the armed resistance to the Soviets met this afternoon with a group of United States senators. One of those senators at the meeting was Senator Richard Lugar, Republican of Indiana, a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Senator, did Dr. Spoon and his colleague convince you that the United States should do more to help their country, to help the resistance movement?
Yes, and I think it's fair to say that the senators who attended the meeting all wanted to do more. They signified that by their interest, that this issue continues on. It's not a dead issue by any means, and there is a new administration coming on and some opportunity for rethinking.
Well, you must have done some rethinking yourself on this. Where do you come down in terms of what kind of help you can give to these folks that the United States can, realistically?
Well, Jim, on this show almost a year ago, I suggested both overt and covert aid, including arms to Afghanistan, as a responsible move at that time. Now, it seems to me that that would still be good advice, but I would temper it with these thoughts subsequently, that we have another opportunity with Governor Reagan coming to power to have a multinational look at this. In other words, I think we bungled it before with our NATO allies and with others who might have helped us, and we have another opportunity to explore with Pakistan ways in which we might be helpful without jeopardizing Pakistan's relationship with the Soviet Union in particular. Now, Governor Reagan has talked about linkage. He's talked about the various costs that must be assumed by the Soviets. And we have the further thought that if we are not effective with regard to Afghanistan, the Soviets might be adventurous in Poland, for example, or in some other places. There are still a number of areas that are related in a way, and the Reagan administration offers some new opportunities to explore what linkage means and how we are more credible to the Soviets than our allies.
But, Senator, it still goes back to the question, does it not, that we even discussed a year ago on this program. How does the United States provide arms to Dr. Spoon and his people without becoming an involved party as far as the Soviet Union is concerned, and all that means?
I suspect that we delimit our involvement. I would not be opposed to saying up front that the United Nations has condemned this aggression. We have condemned it. The President of the United States, President Carter, said the most important thing, most tragic thing since World War II. Now, having said all of that, it persists, and after a year, up front, we're prepared to send arms to Afghanistan if the Soviets are not prepared to come to the table and to begin to talk about a political solution, which does not mean pacification, as my friends have said tonight, but a very definite change in the aggressive policies.
Do you think that, that the armed resistance route is the route to a solution?
Well, I think it is an essential part. I would agree with our guest today who would say that, of course, a political solution must occur. The Afghan freedom fighters will not be able to defeat the Soviet Union in great numbers if the Soviets devote themselves to it. But our guest also said it's costing the Soviets $15 million a day to continue this on. It might cost the Soviets even more. And as we change the calculus of this, I think we'll make progress.
If you have great communications within President-elect Reagan's camp, if he or someone representing him were to come to you and say, okay, Brother Lugar, tell us what you think we ought to do as far as Afghanistan is concerned, what would be at the top of your list right now, specifically?
Well, to consult with our NATO allies, to consult with Pakistan quietly, and not to make comments on this program or elsewhere, but to try to think through now, where do we go, and to make certain we have a multinational solution that sticks.
Thank you. Robin?
Dr. Spoon, what quantity of arms would make a significant difference in the ability of the resistance movement to make it more costly for the Soviet Union?
Well, the war is already costly to the Soviet Union. I cannot really give you the number of SAMs we need. I'm no military expert, and I do not have detailed information on this. But when and if this materializes, there will be a feasibility study to speak of before it happens.
Well, I've read conflicting reports that you are both asking for more arms and not asking for more arms. Are you in fact asking American authorities, the Defense Department, whoever, in one way or another to help get some more arms to the rebel hands?
Well, we're explaining the situation, and the inevitable result is that well, after we've explained the situation, that we need arms to fight against the Soviets, and that should be obvious, shouldn't it?
Yes. Is that obvious to you, Mr. Lugar, Senator Lugar?
Yes, I think it's obvious, but I suspect also that simply having some arms in that area might change the price of weapons and bullets. My understanding is that right now, even these supplies bought in the free market are very, very expensive, and it's obvious the logistic flow has been stopped by all sorts of reasons.
What is your opinion as a diplomat, Mr. Paktiawal, of the sense of the United States more or less openly getting some more arms to that area and letting the Soviets know that they're there and can reach the resistance forces?
Well, I'm in a belief in education is that our confrontation will not solve the problem. It will make it more difficult for the people of the world. But the best way is to find some political solution. This is my wish that the United States should put some more efforts to find some political solution for that.
What could the United States do, Mr. Khalilzad, to work for a political solution more aggressively?
Well, I think that it is very unlikely so far. There is, in fact, no signal from the Soviet Union that anyone knows of the Soviets are interested in a political solution of the Afghan crisis. If there was any signal, I think the United States could do a lot. You know that some have thought that the Soviets came into Afghanistan because they feared that Afghanistan will turn into a hostile state to the Soviet Union, and in
particularly
fact,
to their Muslim population.
Well, if that was the purpose, and that may be one of the many purposes for which they came in, but if that was the exclusive purpose, they would have accepted the British plan for neutralization of Afghanistan, an international guarantee for a neutralized Afghanistan. They call that proposal ridiculous. So it seems to me that as long as we don't have any signal at all that the Soviets are interested in a peaceful resolution of the conflict, in a political settlement which would involve the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan, it is very unlikely that such a settlement or such a compromise could be found.
So you think that there's nothing that the United States can do now really effectively to push for a political solution? The only thing is to step up the fighting a little bit more?
Well, I think that the United States has to follow toward that region as a whole a multi-pronged policy. It has to involve supporting sympathetic groups within the resistance to increase the cost of occupation of Afghanistan. The United States has to strengthen its own presence in the region, to support the sympathetic countries, in particularly Turkey and Pakistan, and to keep up the channels of communication open with the Soviet Union. When and if they become interested in a political compromise, that the U.S. should be there and accept to such a compromise.
Are we settling in, Senator Lugar, for a fairly long-term thing with the Soviets in Afghanistan?
It's not really clear. I think, as the doctor just pointed out, there are no particular signals that we're headed toward a political solution for the moment, but then the Soviets are looking for signals from Governor Reagan, from the new administration. They're looking for a number of things, and this may be an opportune time to try to test the waters.
Well, we'll see whether that happens. Thank you all for joining us in Washington tonight. Good night, Jim.
Good night, Robin.
Dr. Kluzan, thank you. That's all for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow night. I'm Robert McNeil. Good night. For nearly 2 years, a large Soviet army has been trying to crush guerrilla resistance in Afghanistan. Now there is fresh evidence that the Soviets are failing. Good evening. While the United States is freshly worried about threats to its friends in the Middle East, military planners in Moscow may be getting more worried about Afghanistan. For nearly 2 years, a force of some 85,000 Soviet troops has been bogged down trying to subdue scattered bands of Afghan tribesmen who maintain their armed resistance to the Soviet occupation. In Washington, the Soviet presence there is often cited as another reason for American anxiety about the security of the Persian Gulf area. But in Moscow, it may increasingly look, as some in the West have been predicting, that Afghanistan would become the Soviets' Vietnam. Tonight, with a journalist who recently visited the Afghan guerrilla forces, we examine the state of resistance to the Soviet occupation. Jim?
Robin, for the record, the Soviets deny their invasion of Afghanistan was in fact an invasion. They claim their troops, tanks, helicopters, and other military hardware are there as friends of the government of President Babrak Karmal, invited by him to stabilize matters against the Afghan tribesmen who have been in a state of rebellion since 1968. That's when a coalition of 3 communist political leaders with Soviet help overthrew the government and established a Marxist state. Karmal was one of the 3 instigators. The other 2, Hafizullah Amin and Nur Mohammad Taraki, preceded him as president and are now both dead. Taraki was fatally wounded in September of 1979 in a gun battle between his supporters and those of Amin. Amin then took over as president. 2 months later, he was captured by Soviet paratroopers and executed. Karmal was immediately proclaimed president as the Soviet army crossed over the border to do what neither Taraki nor Amin had been able to do, subdue the rebels once and for all and control the country. Robin?
In 1980, Christian Science Monitor reporter Edward Girardet visited Afghanistan twice. He's just made a 3rd trip to compare impressions. His month-long visit involved a 700-mile trek crossing the border from northern Pakistan. His destination was the Panjshir Valley, near the strategic highway linking Kabul, the Afghan capital, with the Soviet Union.
The Panjshir Valley is one of the major resistance centers against the Soviet-backed Kabul regime. Traveling with a 50-horse caravan laden with weapons, ammunition, and medicine, it took us 10 days to get to the valley. Our trail led through some of the most rugged terrain in the world, the 20,000-foot-high Hindu Kush Mountains. At any one time, the caravan was spread out over several miles to avoid patrolling Soviet helicopters. Two groups of Afghan guerrillas formed this particular 19th century-style caravan, one of dozens along the secret route during the snow-free summer months. 50 were returning to fight the communists from their haven in the Panjshir Valley. The others, about 20, were heading inland before branching off to the north to join partisan units along the Soviet border. Also in the caravan were a French medical team on their way to operate a clandestine hospital. Apart from the occasional distant thunder of a MiG, we saw little sign of the Soviets. But there were mines. Shortly after crossing into Afghanistan, one of the guerrillas stepped on a Soviet booby trap. The doctors had to perform an on-the-spot amputation using a penknife and their emergency medical kit, as their surgical instruments were loaded on a horse several hours to the rear. Our arrival in the valley was marked by the lushness of irrigated green fields and terraced orchards. Since the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the 80,000 Tajik inhabitants of the Panjshir Valley have offered stubborn resistance. 4 times in the past 18 months, Soviet and Afghan government troops have launched massive offensives using tanks, helicopters, and MiGs in an attempt to crush the guerrillas. But on each occasion, the communists were forced back, leaving a trail of wrecked equipment. The man behind the Panjshir's resolute determination to resist what the Afghans consider to be the infidel repression of the communists is a 27-year-old former engineering student, guerrilla commander Ahmed Shah Massoud. Both his resourceful leadership and acute knowledge of modern guerrilla warfare has earned Massoud a reputation not unlike that of Che Guevara. The main problem facing Massoud is still the lack of weapons. But the Afghans are certainly better equipped than in the early days of the occupation. Most military supplies in the Panjshir Valley consist of captured communist material. Many of Massoud's hardened frontline fighters carry AK-47 and the more modern AK-74 assault rifles. Only 1/4 of their weapons is said to come from Pakistan. Despite reports of substantial foreign assistance from the United States, China, and the Gulf nations, resistance groups inside the country bitterly complain that even if outside aid is filtering through, they see very little of it. Yet the combat effectiveness of Massoud's roughly 1,000 disciplined and well-armed guerrillas illustrates a striking improvement in the overall ability of the Afghan resistance to fight an increasingly successful war of attrition against the Soviets. Rather than launching large free-for-all attacks against communist bases and convoys, carefully planned strategy using small but more incisive units, well-versed in guerrilla tactics, has become the name of the game. Massoud has sought to mold the traditional Afghan tribesman into a modern guerrilla fighter. Since the communist takeover, he has trained more than 5,000 men at bases in the valley. So impressed are other resistance groups, including political rivals, that they have begun sending supporters of the Panjshir for schooling from elsewhere in the country. Recruitment continues despite the fact that graves of guerrilla fighters are a common sight. Up to 80% of the valley's houses, mosques, and schools have been damaged or destroyed during the communist offensives. But the Panjshiris are determined to survive. New mud and stone dwellings emerge from the ruins. Farmers thresh mounds of ripened wheat, and shopkeepers offer anything from fresh meat to melons and tomatoes in the village bazaars. Schools have been re-established, and the French doctors, apart from treating war victims, have begun to create a general health service for the valley. In many respects, the Panjshir Valley is run like a semi-autonomous state. Loosely affiliated with the Pakistan-based Jamiat Islami, one of the 7 major Afghan political parties, Massoud heads a resistance council with 8 ministries responsible for defense, finance, information, and other activities. The resistance also operates its own POW camp for Afghan communist teachers, government officials, and military officers who've either been captured or kidnapped. As a rule, the guerrillas take no Russians alive, a major factor in contributing toward demoralization among Soviet troops. The Panjshir is but one valley. Political disunity remains among the Pakistan-based parties, but as I left, it was clear that growing numbers of guerrillas from Afghanistan's vast patchwork of resistance groups are prepared to fight together.
That report was by Edward Girardet of the Christian Science Monitor, who also took most of these pictures and who is with us this evening. Mr. Girardet, how has the situation changed since your last visit about a year before?
Well, about a year before, I was in the south and one other region of Afghanistan, and the guerrillas were on the whole extremely disorganized. They were also poorly armed and would tend to make these large swarmed attacks of maybe 100 to 200 men, and I think they were rather ineffective. But going back a year later, the situation had changed almost completely, particularly in the Panjshir Valley. Not only are the guerrillas there better armed, but they're also better organized, and they've begun to use tactics, strategy. For example, they would use small, tightly knit groups with better armed guerrillas, and they would really plan their attacks, which was also not the case about a year ago. Another important point is that they also coordinate with other rival political groups in other areas as long as they respect these areas.
How rival are they still? I remember from your reports and some others a year and longer ago that the rebels seemed to be squabbling among themselves almost as much as they were fighting the Soviets. Has that changed?
Well, I think one has to remember that there are these 7 major political groups in Peshawar, but this is not Afghanistan. Afghanistan is basically divided up into a patchwork of resistance groups. There are perhaps maybe 200-300 resistance groups. It could be perhaps a valley, such as the Panjshir Valley, or an entire region, such as the Hazarajat, which is in central Afghanistan. This, I think, is where the resistance really is. And
are they still all operating on an uncoordinated freelance basis, just as they each see fit?
There is no central leadership, but they coordinate attacks, which is one major development.
Are they in communication with each other?
Oh, yes, yes. Their main system of communication is messengers. It's very, 18th century, 19th century.
But there's no national leadership?
No national leadership.
Or no national directive going
Nothing
on?
At all. Nothing at all.
Now, on the matter of arms, you said in the report we've just heard that they complained that if there was aid coming in, very little of it was reaching them. Did you actually see any evidence of American or Western military aid getting through?
First of all, I think it would be impossible to say because, as Sadat said, he has been, or the American aid has been coming in through Egypt, mainly Soviet-type arms, but a lot of the arms you see with the Afghans are Soviet arms.
So you wouldn't know whether those were captured or whether they were...
No. I came in with this 50-horse caravan, which was carrying mainly Soviet weapons. Now, these could have come from the Pakistani bazaars, or they could have come from Egypt, but I think one can't determine that.
You have no way of knowing that.
No way of knowing.
Did you have any hint that the rebels are in any kind of clandestine contact with the CIA or other Western agencies?
Nothing at all. I think the Afghans, this is their main complaint. They feel they've been totally neglected by the West, particularly the United States, and they kept asking me, why is the U.S. not doing anything? This was their main complaint, and I think contacts with the CIA, and I haven't seen any evidence, and neither have other journalists I've talked to or French doctors who are inside. There are about 20 French doctors working inside Afghanistan.
Do you have any way of knowing how typical that very stable situation in the Panjshir Valley, which you described, is of the rest of Afghanistan?
I think it's probably more stable than a lot of other areas. Again, because of this patchwork system of resistance groups, you have some which are more organized and more efficient than others. But I think from what I've heard from other parts, there is a growing sense of efficiency among the Afghans, although I think the Panjshir Valley was particularly well organized, particularly because of Massoud, who himself is, as I mentioned, the Che Guevara, in a sense, of the Afghan resistance.
In general, would you be able to say whether the Soviets have extended their control over the parts of the countryside or whether that area of control has shrunken in the last year?
I think it's shrunken because, walking into Afghanistan, we walked through a lot of land, through the mountains, and there was really no sign of the Soviets except the mines. And, very often you would feel that you were in Switzerland. It was peaceful, idyllic, and no sign of the war except bombed buildings from the earlier days of the occupation. But I think from what I've been hearing from Afghans, from other journalists, from the doctors, the Soviets really only occupy, and I wouldn't say control, but they occupy the towns, and of course use the highways, but at a risk.
Finally, what is your own reading on why the Soviets seem not able to deal decisively with the situation there?
I think the main reason is the terrain, because Panjshir Valley is a good example. It's a very mountainous country, and to get in, we have to go through a narrow gorge. And what the Soviets have been doing so far in these past 4 offensives has been to drive in with tanks. And this is rather easy to block for the Afghans, who are getting better armed, you know, with anti-tank guns and rockets. And the Russians have not been coming out except in a few cases. I think if they do come out more and fight on a man-to-man basis in the mountains, they'll suffer more casualties, but probably be more effective. But then I think also the Afghans have become more effective as guerrilla fighters using tactics.
Well, thank you. Jim?
Another perspective now from Robert Newman, U.S. Ambassador to Afghanistan in the late 60s and early 70s, and currently a member of the Afghanistan Relief Board, a group working to get arms and money to the Afghan guerrillas. Mr. Newman headed the Reagan State Department transition team and afterwards served for several months as the U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia. He resigned over differences with Secretary of State Alexander Haig and is now a senior associate at the Georgetown Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Ambassador, what kind of support are the guerrillas receiving from the West?
Well, that's of course a secret. They do get some, but it goes in through many channels. It has to, and it is, as Mr. Girardet said, of all of Russian make or copies of Russian make, so you can't tell. Since there are so many groups, it's very difficult to say which equipment goes to whom. I'm not also sure that, first of all, I know the Afghans very well. They always complain, and even if they had weapons come out of their arms or their ears, they would still be complaining because they want some more. That's only natural. But they're doing very well with what they have, and they have to operate in small groups, because if there were larger groups, there would be larger targets.
What are their major needs from...
Ammunition. Mr.
What kind of ammunition? I mean, small arms ammunition?
All kinds, especially rocket launchers, especially against the helicopters. But all kinds, because while they make a great deal themselves, still there's never enough. And also they have to pay for them. Even though the Afghans make it for Afghans, or tribesmen on the other side of the borders make it for them, they have to be paid for it, and sometimes the price is quite high. People are working and fighting for Afghanistan, but they don't forget their natural tendencies about making money.
Sure. Mr. Girardet just said that many of the guerrillas said, why isn't the United States, why isn't the West generally helping us? What you're saying is they are, they just don't realize it.
Well, that's true, but also if it became a major action, I don't think it would benefit Afghanistan. This has to be a somewhat clandestine operation, very clandestine, and one of the reasons is the attitude of Pakistan. Pakistan is in a very delicate position because all this assistance has to come through Pakistan. There's no other way of getting it into the interior of the country. Consequently, the Pakistanis would be very upset if there were a very open kind of a railroad going to the insurgents. Consequently, it is well that it is very quiet.
Do you agree with what's your assessment of the unification or the unity of the guerrilla forces now?
Well, it is exactly as Mr. Girardet said. There is more operational unity. There is also some among the politicians in Peshawar. I don't think they amount to a great deal. But there is one very important division. There are those who are fundamentalists, the Hizb al-Islami, and they are very close to the present Pakistani government. But they desire an Afghanistan along fundamentalist lines. Now, there are many other Afghans who want a modern Afghanistan, and they're uncomfortable with that, and that division is likely to continue. But in the field, operationally, they seem to be able to do what is necessary, and the smaller the groups are, the better they fight and the less the target. This is, after all, a country, as we have seen in the picture, that has relatively little vegetation. We have seen some green pastures, but there are not that many in Afghanistan. It's not like Vietnam with its lush vegetation. So a larger group would find concealment very difficult.
Is the situation to an almost permanent state of stalemate now?
Well, if you can call mutual killing stalemate, yes. Of course, the Afghans cannot drive out the Russians, but it's very clear now that the Russians cannot master the situation, and both sides are settling down to a fight that may last for years. Certainly, I know that my Afghan friends expect that.
Thank you. Robin?
Finally, we look at how the Afghan situation may be viewed in the Kremlin. Robert Legvold is a political scientist at Columbia University, a senior fellow in charge of the Soviet project for the Council on Foreign Relations. He returned only last Sunday from a visit to Moscow, where he talked with Soviet policymakers and foreign policy analysts. Mr. Legvold, how do the Soviets view their struggle in Afghanistan?
Well, if you set aside the official version of what's happening in Afghanistan and how well they're doing it, how well they're doing in Afghanistan, I think their judgment is roughly the same as Ambassador Newman's. That is, that it has now emerged as both a military and a political stalemate. And I think they feel that it is going to remain that stalemate for some time to come. It's important that they see that stalemate as at a relatively low and tolerable level, and thus they can think in terms of the long run.
I was going to ask you, is there any hint that the cost may be getting too high for them in one way or another to cause them to want to pull out?
No, I think not. I don't think it's come close to that point. Any way that you measure it, in terms of the material cost of the war, in terms of the human loss to them soldiers, in terms even of attitude within the Soviet Union on the score of the war, even though the war is unpopular so far as I can gather among important segments of the Soviet public.
How do you know it's unpopular? That's a very rare thing to be able to say with any confidence, is it not?
Yes, and I don't think it reflects any precise knowledge of public attitude within the Soviet Union, but I think it's unpopular because I was told by Soviets during my visit that it was unpopular.
Did you find that surprising, that they would be that candid about it?
No, I wasn't that surprised. I've had conversations about similar topics where they've been candid on that score.
Is it the casualty rate that is causing the unpopularity of it?
I don't think so. One of the problems here, though, is that because the regime doesn't share information about the actual level of casualty, the rumors circulate wildly within the Soviet Union, and it may be that there's an exaggerated notion of what the losses are in Afghanistan. Our estimates are that they're losing between 20 and 25 people a week, which would be casualties in an order of between 1,000 and 1,300 a year. But the rumors that circulate are not only that there are Soviet soldiers dying in Afghanistan, which is an unpopular idea among their people, but there are also ugly rumors of the way in which the soldiers die, which I think adds to the effect of the loss.
What does that mean? The way the tribesmen mete out justice, or
the way the soldiers are mutilated?
The way they're mutilated. Is there any sign, conversely, that the Soviet Union might be getting so impatient that it would want to be willing to throw a lot more force in and try and make an end to it?
No, I don't think so. Again, as I said, an important consideration is that they see the war continuing at a relatively low level. They think that while they believe the United States is making its contribution, they're struck by the fact that that contribution remains at a low level, and the Americans appear not to be interested in trying to escalate the war to a much higher level. They feel that in the long run they can pay, for a very long time, they can pay the price that they're paying, and there is no need to, as a matter of fact, there is a need not to try and escalate the war in present circumstances.
Why is Afghanistan so important to them?
Well, originally, I think they took a decision to undertake the invasion of Afghanistan because the way in which they thought a regime with which they had aligned, that is, Amin's regime, was losing on their border, and that it would create a situation in Afghanistan unlike anything they'd had before. That is, a potentially unfriendly regime. Over the years, they've had at least a deferential regime, and many would say even aligned with the Soviets in one fashion or another. And I think they thought that situation would be lost at a time when the entire region was increasingly unstable, particularly in the context of a recrudescent Islamic fundamentalism in the area. And so they moved in. I think they moved in essentially because they thought this was an important measure in order to secure their border. I don't think that they moved in order to take a first step toward the oil fields. That's not to say that the action wasn't dangerous for whatever reason they undertook it, and that it wasn't dangerous because they would not be willing to duplicate the same thing if there's instability in Iran and they feel that they're losing control of the situation in Iranian Azerbaijan, for example. So it is a dangerous move.
Well, thank you. Jim?
Mr. Jaraday, the tribesmen you talk to, do they ever talk in terms of a negotiated settlement to stop the fighting?
No, they were adamant that the only way they would accept a solution would be for the Russians to leave. and they're also adamant that there would be no communists left. In fact, there are probably between 3,000 and 5,000 party-carrying communists in Afghanistan, I mean Afghans. And I asked them, what would you do to these people? And they said, well, obviously they cannot live here, otherwise would kill them.
Yeah. What's your feeling for that, Mr. Ambassador?
Well, there's no doubt about it.
Is a political settlement for this possible?
There cannot be a settlement. It wouldn't matter. If you made a settlement on paper, the communists who remain in the country wouldn't live to see the evening of that day. Nobody could control that kind of visceral action. In regard to some of the earlier statements with which I entirely agree, I think the Russians didn't know what they were getting into. First, they helped a communist revolution in '78. And after all, that sort of thing worked in other countries, so why shouldn't it work in Afghanistan? Except it didn't. The Afghans are very different people. Well, then came the situation that was just referred to, where the native communists couldn't hold and the Russians marched in, and with their tremendous show of weaponry, they thought that that would do it, and it didn't, because nothing does with the Afghans. They're that kind of people.
Have the Russians pretty well gotten away with this thing, though, politically? You heard what was said about the feeling in the Soviet Union was that the United States wasn't going to escalate this thing. This thing is, you said it yourself, this thing is probably going to go on for years and years and years. Is the heat off?
The heat is off as far as the foreign countries are concerned, especially Europe, which is a little bit soft on that and other subjects. If it were closer, it might be different, and also the eyes of Europe are more on Poland than on Afghanistan. However, there are other hidden factors. The first troops that the Soviets sent in were from neighboring provinces in the Soviet Union, were Muslim troops. And they proved to be dubious to unreliable, and they were quickly moved out. Now, by the end of this century, the majority of the Soviet population will be non-Russian, many of them Muslim. The Russians have been very sensitive about that problem way back to the days of Stalin, when he was Commissar for Nationalities. So there is a sensitivity here. Then, if we don't know what's going to happen in Iran and what the Russian relation to that, well, that's another Muslim nation. They have to be concerned about that. And while, of course, the Russians are hugely superior in manpower and equipment to the West, it is not unlimited. If they had an Iranian situation to handle and the Afghan situation on their hand, and then something broke in Poland, well, their resources would be strained, so there are limits.
Yeah. Mr. Legbo, let me ask you, did you get the feeling when you were in the Soviet Union that the Russians feel, okay, they took some heat at the beginning, the Olympic boycott and all those other kinds of things, it's low-key now, and for all practical purposes, the rest of the world has accepted their presence there in Afghanistan from now until the end of time?
The general way you put it, I think, is true. That is, I think the Soviets do feel that the heat is off or reduced. I don't think they feel that the rest of the world, including the Islamic nations, have accepted what they're doing in Afghanistan. But as a central problem of their foreign policy, I think they feel the worst is over.
They feel that nothing's going to be done about it as long as it doesn't get any worse? Is that?
Essentially. One person said to me, look, he said, it's a mess. He said, there's no going back. We're not going back. It's a test for the Red Army. The Red Army cannot be defeated by the insurgents. We cannot defeat the insurgents. In terms of a political settlement, there's nothing that we can offer that the other side, that is Pakistan, Iran, or the West, will accept. There's nothing that they're going to offer which will allow Babrak Karmal's regime to be established, which we can accept, and therefore here we sit. And the essential hope was that the issue would not be a central issue in Soviet-American, the problem wouldn't be a central issue in Soviet-American relations, or heated up in a fashion that seriously, that causes serious problems for the Soviet Union. One last point, I agree with Ambassador Newman. I heard from the Soviet side that they feel there is an interconnection between Afghanistan and Poland. People have said to me that one of the constraints on their action in Poland is Afghanistan, and one of the constraints on the degree to which they escalate in Afghanistan is Poland.
Mr. Jaraday, finally, in a few seconds, you have the feeling it's also going to go on for years and years and years and years, and do the guerrillas you were with understand that and accept that?
I think so. I think they realize it's a no-win situation. But before leaving, I asked them, what are you going to do when you get more weapons? And they said, well, we're going to move into the cities. And I think this will be a problem, because with the troops that the Soviets have now in Afghanistan, I think they're going to suffer more casualties, and they are suffering heavy casualties, I think.
Thank you. Robin?
Yes, Ambassador Newman, thank you for joining us in Washington. Mr. Legwold in New York. Mr. Girardet, thank you very much. Good night, Jim.
Good night, Robin.
That's all for tonight. We'll be back on Monday night. I'm Robert McNeil. Good night. Are the Soviets getting tired of the war in Afghanistan? Tonight, an insider's look at the fighting. Good evening. Tonight we have a new look at Afghanistan, where resistance forces have been battling Soviet invaders for nearly 3 years. The 100,000 Soviet soldiers with tanks, jets, and helicopter gunships have been unable to crush the resistance offered by thousands of Afghan tribesmen, moved by equally fierce nationalism and Islamic faith. Western reporters who have returned recently from long trips with the rebel forces have brought back a picture of increasing military stalemate. On the official level, the U.S. State Department says there's no evidence to indicate that the Soviets have changed their position on Afghanistan. Yet other Western observers have picked up faint hints that the Soviets might like to find a face-saving way out of a situation many have likened to the U.S. quagmire in Vietnam. Tonight, with fresh eyewitness accounts of the fighting, are the Soviets wearying of the Afghan struggle? Jim Lehrer is off tonight. Charlene Hunter-Galtz in Washington. Charlene?
Robin, in May, the Soviets launched another offensive against one of the toughest centers of rebel resistance, the Panjshir Valley, a fertile farming center 40 miles north of Kabul. Their daily attacks were witnessed by 2 American reporters who had walked over the mountains with rebel forces. Edward Girardet is a special correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor. This was his 4th trip inside Afghanistan since the Soviet invasion in December 1979. He was accompanied by Bill Dowell, a radio correspondent and writer who has covered the wars in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, as well as the revolution in Iran. He is now ABC Radio News correspondent in Paris. First, Bill Dowell reports what he saw of the Soviet offensive.
Like countless invaders before them, the Soviets have run into Afghanistan's 2 classic defenses, its people and its terrain. The Soviets have made ingenious use of helicopters, particularly heavily armored Mi-24 gunships. But Afghanistan's mountains are so high, the helicopters have to fly at their maximum altitude. Even then, an increasing number are being shot down by guerrilla machine guns on mountain peaks. The Soviets have not been able to get beyond their love of heavy armor and massive deployments of tanks. But in Afghanistan, where the rebels move swiftly over steep mountain passes, armored vehicles are often relatively useless. Weapons such as these Katyusha rocket launchers are some of the most awesome in the Soviet arsenal. Each launcher can fire 40 rockets simultaneously. In theory, a launcher can wipe out an entire village in less than 30 seconds. But Afghanistan's tall mountains and deep valleys provide natural protection, blocking the rockets. The launcher, like many other Soviet weapons, looks good. It just doesn't work in Afghanistan. Few events underscore the pitfalls of fighting a war in Afghanistan more than the recent Soviet offensive against guerrillas in the Panjshir Valley, 40 miles north of Kabul. On May 17th, after intensive bombing, Soviet helicopters landed Russian and Afghan commandos at key points along the length of the 70-mile valley. While the commandos tried to secure the valley floor, Afghan tanks, followed by Soviet tanks, tried to enter the valley from the south. The guerrillas waited until the Afghan tanks had passed a narrow gorge. Then they set off explosives, triggering a landslide that buried dozens of Soviet armored vehicles. Hundreds of Afghan troops who found themselves trapped alone inside the valley defected to the guerrillas. They brought 9 tanks with them. The Soviet and Afghan troops who outnumbered the guerrillas nearly 10 to 1 were eventually able to take the floor of the valley by sheer force of numbers. But when they did, the guerrillas simply moved into the side valleys and onto the surrounding mountaintops. The Soviets stayed in the valley a little more than a month, fighting a curious kind of routine war. At 5 in the morning, MiGs and helicopters would fly out to bomb. They would return for lunch at around noon, fly out again an hour later to bomb in the afternoon, and then return for supper. Villagers who would go to shelters like these during the daytime would go back to their houses at night. Towards the end of June, the Soviets began pulling out most of their troops, leaving a few Afghan troops behind. Radio Kabul and Radio Moscow claimed that the offensive was a complete victory. It clearly had disrupted the economic life of the valley, but the guerrillas had also managed to destroy scores of armored vehicles and to shoot down more than a dozen helicopters. They managed to capture new weapons like this Soviet grenade-firing minigun and hundreds of the latest Soviet assault rifles. Even if the guerrillas had not fired a shot, the offensive, with its deployment of tens of thousands of troops and hundreds of helicopters and armored vehicles, would have cost the Soviets heavily. More discouraging from a Russian point of view, this was the fifth offensive the Soviets had launched against the Panjshir Valley in less than 3 years. In the end, it was not clear that they'd come any closer to wiping out Afghan resistance.
Now, Edward Girodet reports on how the rebels are organized and how they withstood the Soviet attacks. Following that report, Robin talked with Girodet and Dowell just before they left the United States.
The Soviet offensive was aimed at crushing one of Afghanistan's most influential resistance centers. The Russians were particularly determined to destroy Ahmad Shah Massoud, the well-organized resistance commander who has built himself a nationwide reputation as the Lion of Panjshir. Nowhere else has the guerrilla movement shown itself to be stronger and more effective than in this fertile, high mountain valley. The Soviet and Afghan government forces failed to defeat the Panjshir guerrillas. They have, however, made their presence felt. Attacks against the valley forced hundreds of families to seek refuge amid stone shelters and caves in the narrow side valleys. Many of them lost their homes. In Afghanistan, mud and stone houses can be easily rebuilt, no more than a week or two, but the prolonged communist occupation threatens to have a lingering impact on the valley's economy. Farmers have been prevented from returning to irrigate their fields and fruit orchards. Resistance leaders also fear that the Soviets will use chemical defoliants to prevent the soil from being cultivated for years to come. Food supplies in the Panjshir are desperately short. Wheat, sugar, and tea have dribbled through from neighboring areas. Guerrillas have been sharing their rations, hidden months earlier in secret mountain caches, with local inhabitants. Massoud warns that unless adequate outside aid can be brought in, the valley's 80,000 residents will face severe hardship. If food supplies fail, the resistance would face two equally dismal choices: either force the Panjshiris to seek help from the communists or send them to Pakistan as refugees. In both cases, the Soviet-backed Karmal regime would enjoy a propaganda victory. Resistance in Afghanistan continues to be a vast patchwork of independently run groups, but there are increasing signs that the Panjshir resistance model is spreading. New local commanders, many of them young, are emerging as potential future leaders. Pushing out the older traditional chiefs and mullahs, they're challenging the exiled political organizations in Pakistan. The past year or two has seen an increasingly sophisticated resistance structure. During the Panjshir offensive, hundreds of fighters from regions as far away as central Afghanistan and the Soviet border walked down to help. Another sign of improved guerrilla organization are horse and camel caravans. Carrying weapons ranging from Chinese mines to the occasional anti-aircraft gun, they are now a common sight along the old nomad trails. So are the resistance-operated chaikhanas, or tea houses. Normally used as rest hostels and restaurants, they also serve as local resistance headquarters. They have become part of a simple but effective communications system. Archaic as it may seem, news bulletins with the latest on ambushes, bombings, or offensives are read aloud to both guerrillas and villagers alike. Copies are made, and the news is then whisked away by messengers on foot to other parts of the country. The guerrillas still complain about the lack of anti-aircraft weapons. Most arms have to be captured. Those that come from the outside must be purchased. Nothing is free. Many mujahideen see their dependence on the Pakistani-based political organizations as a means for the exiled leaders to maintain control of their fighting compatriots inside. Islam, however, remains the greatest strength of the resistance. They also harbor a bitter hatred for the Soviets. Once or twice, I've been momentarily mistaken for a Russian. It was not just an uncomfortable feeling. It was an ugly one. The Afghans are willing to defend their homeland and willing to die for it.
Those two reporters are with us now in New York, Edward Girardet and Bill Dow. Ed, what is the net effect of what you've seen over the 3 years in your 4 trips to Afghanistan? Is the situation stalemated, or can you say that one side gradually appears to be gaining an advantage?
Well, I think the guerrillas have definitely begun to improve. I think now we're beginning to see a situation whereby guerrilla groups are improving in certain areas. It's still very much the situation of a patchwork of resistance groups. But you are finding a lot of these young leaders who are beginning to emerge. Weapons have improved greatly, and one is really beginning to see more tactics. And I think particularly now the Panjshir has become such a prominent area and is spreading. For example, it's spread up to the north to Badakhshan province. It's spreading a bit to the south. There are groups now penetrating Kabul with urban guerrilla attacks. And I think the Soviets are really beginning to have more problems now than before, and I think this was proved by the Panjshir offensive, which was really an attempt to try and crush finally this resistance area, which failed.
Are the losses, in any way you can measure them, relatively equal on both sides? If you can't see one significantly winning, can you at least see the things they're losing and count that up?
We talked with doctors who were in the Panjshir Valley from the first day of the offensive, and they said there were practically no guerrilla losses at all.
That's amazing.
The guerrillas knew that the Soviets were going to attack. They knew where the bombing was going to take place. They warned the villagers, and most of them had already left for the mountains by the time the fighting took place.
But so, as you would say, very few losses on the part of the guerrillas, and the losses that you reported on the part of the Soviets.
I think more with civilians. For example, Massoud received news beforehand, of course, that the invasion would take place, and therefore he was able to move his troops outside.
Do you have now an opinion? I remember we asked you this a couple of years ago when you first went in, but do you now have an opinion with your added experience on whether the Soviets can defeat the rebels militarily?
Well, I think certainly with the present number of troops in Afghanistan, no way. They'd have to bring in more, and even then I think it would be really an impossible situation, because as last year, we walked in and you really felt you were not in a war situation. And I think whenever we saw a helicopter would fly over us, and we just hid, and it's virtually impossible to see men walking around the desert and the rocks from 2,000 feet. It's virtually impossible. They would have to really move in many more troops. They'd have to move out to the countryside, sustain more casualties, which they're not doing, and which I'm not sure they really want to do.
Yeah. Do you agree with that?
Yes,
without a much bigger commitment, they could not defeat these rebels.
It would take a tremendous commitment, probably the size of the U.S. commitment in Vietnam to really get into these valleys and trap the guerrillas. The Russians didn't appear to me to be trying to really control the countryside. We walked 150 miles through 4 different provinces, and every single village we passed through was under a guerrilla administration. And we saw no sign whatsoever of any Kabul government presence or of any Soviet presence.
Well, if the Soviets can't wipe out this resistance without a significantly greater commitment there, can the rebels drive the Soviets out and force the Soviets to get out, do you think?
Well, I doubt that very much. For example, just mentioned before concerning the Russians, they really have not got the support of the Afghan forces. I mean, we walked by a number of Afghan forts, and these forts had made agreements with the rebels not to attack. So we walked by, we shook hands with them, and it was really a somewhat absurd situation. But I think the guerrillas themselves, until they can organize themselves better, I mean, you have areas which are very, very good. You have other areas which are really totally incompetent. I mean, the guerrilla fighters have no idea about real guerrilla warfare. They, for example, one group fired mortars without taking the pins out of the mortars, and they had no tactics whatsoever in attacking Afghan or Soviet forts. And
have there been significant defections of the Afghan army, that is, the Soviet-backed army of the Soviet puppet regime there? Have there been significant defections of their
I think there have been
soldiers?
very significant defections, and defections in place, because the doctors we talked to said that Massoud, the guerrilla commander in the valley, had brought them Soviet battle plans and asked them if they could recognize what the symbols meant. They had been given by members of the Kabul government. So I said, well, how is that possible? And they said, well, some of the officials in the Kabul government are not sure the Soviets are going to make it, and they want to cover their bets on both sides.
You mentioned Vietnam, and of course you were in Vietnam as a correspondent. What are the Soviet tactics like and their strategy of kind of combat this, and what's going wrong for them?
Well, I was amazed. There was no effort whatsoever by any of the Soviet forces to interdict supply routes. We were moving in broad daylight with tremendous caravans. I mean, sometimes 50 men, maybe 20, 30 horses. Helicopters would pass overhead. They would make no effort
And those
whatsoever
would be
to stop
easy
them.
to see from the air.
They certainly were. And it looked to me as though the Soviet soldiers on the ground were not really trying to win the war. We passed by Bagram, the major Soviet air base, in broad daylight. There was no patrols out. As far as we could tell, there's no evidence the Soviets go out on the ground at all. Now, if this had been in Vietnam with the American Army, there would have been constant patrolling and very tight security. So I was really very shocked at the...
What do the rebels expect is going to happen in the end? Do they think that the Soviets are just going to get tired and find a way out of this, or they're going to be beaten, or what's going to happen?
Well, last year, Massoud told me that he was going to step up attacks. In fact, they had planned more attacks against Kabul before this recent attack, and now they're beginning to do that again. In fact, they've planned quite a few operations, which I think will really hit rather hard against the Russians in Kabul. They realize they have to make a counteroffensive because, for one thing, they want to impress the local population, and secondly, they want to really make the situation totally insecure for both the Afghan government and the Soviets. But I think they're realistic enough to realize that they cannot throw the Soviets out. It's going to have to be a political solution eventually. But I think they're just going to keep trying, keep hitting as hard as they can. And I think one particular point is that their weapons are improving, and so are their tactics, and the guerrillas can only improve. I think that's the major thing.
I think time is definitely on the side of the guerrillas. And in April 25th, the guerrillas from the Panjshir and Gulbahar, just south of the Panjshir, attacked Bagram Air Base, cut through the perimeter, destroyed 25 helicopters, machine gunned the barracks and the base installations. And the effect of that on the Soviets, this was the first really major attack, I think, of this kind, was really very traumatic.
So you think time is on the guerrilla side. Well, Bill Dowell and Ed Girardet, thank you very much.
The fighting in Afghanistan has prompted diplomatic efforts to seek a negotiated settlement. The United Nations is taking the lead role. Its Undersecretary General Diego Cordovez recently met with the Afghan and Pakistani foreign ministers for a round of talks in Geneva. The UN official is reportedly planning a series of visits this fall to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran to continue the discussions. The U.S. State Department also reported that it has held talks with the Soviets aimed at convincing them to withdraw from Afghanistan. For more on the diplomatic efforts and their prospects, we turn to Selig Harrison, a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He is also the author of the book In Afghanistan's Shadow. Mr. Harrison, why do you think the Soviets seem willing to talk now? Are they getting tired and feeling trapped?
Well, we should be quite clear that at this stage it's too early in the negotiating process to be sure how serious they are. It could be that they're trying to make some propaganda and draw the Pakistanis into a negotiation which would give implicit recognition to their regime in Kabul. But when we look at the situation described so forcefully by Ed Girardet and Mr. Dowell, we don't. It's easy to see that the Soviets can well be having an agonizing reappraisal. They're trying to see what kind of a deal they might be able to get. And they certainly, when they got into Afghanistan, they never expected it to be as difficult as it has turned out to be, either militarily or politically. First of all, at the political level, they thought they could get together a unified communist party, and they thought that they would find more support for the more moderate wing of the Communist Party that they were installing when they brought their troops in, and that hasn't proved to be true. They don't have a solid political base, and the resistance, with some useful help from the outside, has been able to make the military costs of their occupation increasingly great. So what they see is a situation in which they cannot see the light at the end of the tunnel. So
that they cannot see the light, for example, of a military victory.
No, that's right. They can't be forced out, but neither can they see a situation in which they might consolidate a regime that they could keep in power without the suppression of the people in a very, very bloody way. And every time they are seen suppressing people in the way that they've had to do in this tragic episode in the Panjshir Valley, the Islamic world is extremely upset. Iran, in particular, right next door, where they have important political stakes, Pakistan, the non-aligned countries, India in particular, where they've put a lot of their political emphasis, even among the communist parties, Mexico and France, they've had a very outraged reaction, and world public opinion in general still has them on the defensive, so they're paying a very high political and diplomatic price. But we shouldn't be under the impression that that is enough, or that the military costs are enough to force them to surrender or retreat and leave Afghanistan with their tail between their legs.
All right. Well, in that case, and based on the talks that have proceeded so far, do you get the impression that there are concessions that they would be willing to make in order to extricate themselves from this whole thing, quote unquote, with honor?
Well, they made some concessions to get these talks going, and that's what's interesting, and that's what's important.
You mean just the fact that the talks have begun as a concession?
They dropped their demand that the government in Kabul be recognized by Pakistan. They have agreed to the UN taking a very active role, an initiating role, instead of a mere ceremonial role. And I think that you can't approach this at the superpower level, because if the United States goes to the Soviet Union and says, you should get out of Afghanistan, we're trying to make them the defendant at the bar. They won't leave, it seems to me, under those circumstances, but they're trying to see whether in a more face-saving way, through the UN framework, they might be able to strike a deal that would gradually make it possible to withdraw by stages with the reciprocal cessation of what they call foreign interference from Pakistan and Iran, with the help of the Western and Middle Eastern countries that are helping the resistance.
All right, thank you. Robin?
We have another view now from a woman who's been studying Afghanistan since the early 50s, since she lived and worked there. Roseanne Klass is director of the Afghan Information Center at Freedom House, a non-governmental organization which monitors political, civil, and human rights around the world. Ms. Klass is the author of a book and many magazine articles on Afghanistan. Ms. Klass, do you see signs that the Soviets may be looking for a way out?
I think that they are looking to solve certain of their problems, but I don't think they are that anxious to get out of Afghanistan at this time. I would agree that it's proved more costly than they expected, but since Moscow has spent almost 200 years trying to gain control of Afghanistan, I don't really think that 3 years of trouble are enough to change their minds.
In other words, this isn't just the present Soviet regime, this goes back into Tsarist times.
Oh yes, I mean 1838 at least they began active efforts, and reportedly I believe the first Russian plans on Afghanistan are attributed to Peter the Great and Catherine the Great.
Well, what would you see would you divine the present Soviet motivation might be?
I think they are looking for ways to defuse the international price they've had to pay. They have not had to pay a very heavy price. Nevertheless, in the Third World, in the UN, and in terms of propaganda, it has presented a problem for them.
Well, haven't they had the most unanimous opposition that they've ever had in terms of world opinion and UN resolutions?
Oh yes, no question about that. I think that what they are looking for is a cosmetic solution that the world will accept, and perhaps a regime that will be recognized internationally, that will nevertheless leave them in power. I've seen signs for more than a year now that they are looking for a way to put together a sort of popular front government involving nationalist figures who are not communists. Their problem has been that they have only been able to find one turncoat, and I suspect that we may see a few carefully selected defectors planted as potential returnees who might form part of a government which, if it were accepted by the outside world, could then turn around and, on the basis of various treaties, ask the Soviet army to stay or ask Cubans to come in as surrogates. The Cubans have been in, the Vietnamese have been in Afghanistan. They're signing all kinds of treaties with the Bulgarians. But in any case, set up a situation in which the Russians could maintain effective control. And once such a government was recognized by the international community could not protest their inviting in or agreeing to certain things.
There's some speculation I've seen reported that the former Afghan king, Zahir Shah, who's now living in exile in Italy, might be the person who could both unify Afghanistan and be acceptable to the Soviets. What's your reaction to that?
If the king were to become involved, at present he has declined to become involved. I should say that most of the Afghan leadership, the experienced leadership, was murdered since 1978. I mean, about 25 to 50,000 people, an entire educated class wiped out. There are surviving experienced political figures of whom the king is one, and there might be a point at which he would have a role to play. But he is a very cautious man, and it is not likely that he would initiate something. He might come in on something if it was going.
Finally, let me ask each of you, we just have a short time, would you guess that there will be in the next year or so a political solution to this, or we're going to go on with this military situation for a long time?
Well, I think that when you say a year or two, you're talking about the kind of time frame that this negotiating process will have to take. What the UN is trying to do is not going to be accomplished in 6 months or even 8 months. It's going to stretch out over a period of time, during which time I think assistance to the resistance should continue. But if the Soviets get the feeling...
Including the presumed U.S. assistance.
Yes, that's right. I think both military and diplomatic options and diplomatic pressure and military pressure have to be put on the Soviets. But if they're given some realistic options for negotiations through this UN framework, we'll find out what's possible. And I think that a year, 18 months will be the time frame within which this has to unfold.
Would you expect there to be a political settlement?
If you mean a political settlement that would give Afghanistan back some control of its own destiny, which is what the resistance is fighting for, then I would say we're a long way from it. The resistance will have to up the price a good deal. The international political price will have to be upped a great deal. And the resistance will have to get significant aid from outside, which it has not been getting, in order, over a long, long haul, to bring the Soviets to the table.
Thank you. We have to end it there. Ms. Klass, Mr. Harrison, thank you very much for joining us. Good night, Charlene.
Good night, Robert.
That's all for tonight. We will be back tomorrow night. I'm Robert McNeil. Good night.